On her wedding night, a Roman bride would be carried across the threshold. But what historians don't tell you is what happened in the hours that followed, and why ancient writers tried desperately to hide it. If you've studied Roman history, you know the wedding ceremony, the joining of hands, the sacrifice to Juno, the bride's white tunic tied with the knot of Hercules, a symbol of protection. It all seems so civilized, romantic even. Ancient writers described Roman marriages as sacred bonds, as partnerships. The wedding was a joyous public affair, with the whole neighborhood invited to witness the union. But here's what they don't tell you in history class. Roman weddings had two parts. The public ceremony, the one we read about in textbooks, ended at sunset. And then the real ritual began. The one that took place behind closed doors. The one Roman historians wrote about in coded language, in fragments, in whispers. The one they desperately tried to hide from the historical record. Because what happened on a Roman bride's first night wasn't a celebration. It was a systematic breaking, and it started the moment the door closed. The bride would be carried across the threshold, but not by her husband, by his male relatives. This wasn't romantic, it was strategic. Why? Because if she crossed on her own feet, she could technically refuse. She could turn back. And Roman law had complications about consent when it came to the wedding night. So she had to be carried, lifted off the ground, removed from her own agency before she ever entered the house. The poet Catullus, writing in 50 BC, describes the bride's face at this moment with one word: pavida, trembling, not with joy, with terror. But here's where it gets worse. Once inside, she wasn't taken to the bedroom. She was taken to a room where the matronae waited, the married women, older, experienced, some of them her own relatives. Their job? To prepare her. Now you might think this means they dressed her, or comforted her, or gave her advice about marriage. The Roman writer Festus describes their role as preparatio ad nuptias, preparation for the night. But when he tries to explain what this actually involved, his text becomes fragmented, deliberately vague. He writes, the matronae would instruct the bride in those things, which modesty forbids me to name. Those things. Even in ancient Rome, a civilization that showed gladiatorial death, matches as entertainment, there were things too disturbing to write down. But we can piece it together from other sources. And you're not going to like what we find. In 1923, archaeologists excavating a villa in Herculaneum found something unusual. A small room separate from the main bedrooms with faded frescoes on the walls. The images showed women in white tunics, clearly brides, surrounded by older women holding instruments, bronze tools, vials of oil, and one object that made the archaeologists immediately seal the room from public tours: a wooden frame with leather restraints. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Amedeo Maiuri, wrote in his private journal, "What we have discovered suggests the wedding night preparation was not metaphorical, it was surgical." Surgical. Let me read you what the physician Soranus of Ephesus wrote in his gynecological texts from 100 AD. Before the first union, the matronae must ensure the bride's body is made suitable. This process, though painful, is necessary to prevent greater injury during consummation. The instruments must be clean, the restraints firm, her cries ignored. He's describing a medical procedure performed by married women on a terrified teenage girl, without her consent, in preparation for her wedding night. The Roman agronomist Columella casually mentions that wedding night physicians were common household slaves in wealthy families. Their entire job was to be present for this preparation. Pliny, the elder's natural history lists the herbs used to dull the bride's senses during the matrone's work: hemlock, mandrake, opium mixed with wine. They drugged them. And here's the part that made me actually pause when I found it. The medical writer Celsus describes the ideal wedding night preparation as one where the bride remembers nothing of the matrone's work, only waking to find the deed already begun. They wanted her unconscious. But why? Why this systematic brutality? Why this elaborate ritual of violation? Because in Roman law, a marriage wasn't legal until it was consummated. And consummation required evidence, physical proof, blood. Not just any blood, specific, verifiable, witnessed blood. And that's where this ritual becomes truly nightmarish. After the matrone finished their preparation, the bride would be dressed in a specific nightgown. Not for modesty, for practicality. It was white linen, pure white, because it had to show the stains. She would then be led, still drugged, often barely conscious, to the marriage bed. And here's where Roman custom becomes almost incomprehensible to modern minds. The bedroom door would be left open, not metaphorically, actually, physically open. The matrone would wait outside. The groom's male relatives would wait in the adjacent room. Sometimes the bride's own father would be present in the house. Why? Because the marriage had to be witnessed. Not the act itself, that would be shameful even by Roman standards, but the aftermath, the proof. The historian Valerius Maximus describes a legal case from 150 BC where a marriage was annulled because the witnesses could not verify the bride's virginity through the evidence of consummation. The witnesses could not verify. Let that sink in. They were checking, examining. The bloodied sheets would be collected by the matrone, sometimes displayed to the wedding guests the next morning as proof the marriage was legitimate. The Greek historian Plutarch, writing about Roman customs, describes this practice with barely concealed disgust. The Romans treat their brides as one might treat a sacrificial animal. The purity must be proven through the spilling of blood. And if there wasn't enough blood, if the preparation had been too effective, or the girl had been too young and small, or if she'd somehow been damaged before the wedding, the marriage could be annulled. She could be returned to her father in disgrace. Or worse, and this is documented in multiple sources, the groom's family could demand a second night, a more forceful attempt, to produce the required evidence. The poet Juvenal, in his savage Sixth Satire, describes hearing the wedding night screams, repeated thrice, until the sheets finally showed the proof Rome demanded. Thrice. 3 attempts. And through it all, the bride was expected to endure in silence, to accept this as her duty, her sacred obligation to her family and to Rome. But here's the question that historians still can't answer. If this was accepted practice, if this was normal, expected, even legally required, then why did Roman writers try so hard to hide it? In 410 AD, when the Visigoths sacked Rome, they burned the great libraries, thousands of scrolls lost forever, or so we're told. But here's something strange. When medieval monks began copying surviving Roman texts, they found something unusual. Entire sections about marriage customs had been removed, not burned, not lost to time, deliberately cut out, with clean edges, professional deletion. The monk Cassiodorus, writing in 540 AD, noted in his manuscript catalogue, many passages concerning the ritus nuptiarum have been deemed too disturbing for preservation and have been consigned to fire by order of the Church. The Church burned them on purpose. Because even by early Christian standards, in an era that accepted public executions and brutal corporal punishment, these texts were too horrifying to keep. But some fragments survived, hidden in private collections, buried in the margins of other texts, encoded in medical manuals that the Church didn't think to censor. And what they reveal is even darker than what we've discussed, because the wedding night ritual wasn't just about proving virginity, it was about breaking the bride's will. The Stoic philosopher Musonius Rufus, writing in 60 AD, describes the purpose plainly. A wife must be taught obedience from the first night. What she endures then, she will accept always. The wedding night is the foundation of the husband's authority. It was training, systematic, ritualized training, in submission, in powerlessness, in accepting violation as duty. The Roman legal scholar Gaius notes that after the wedding night, a woman could legally never refuse her husband, ever. The wedding night established the precedent of compliance that would govern the marriage. One night of horror to ensure a lifetime of control. And Rome understood this so well that they built an entire ritual around it, with witnesses, with matronae to ensure it was done correctly, with physicians standing by to treat injuries that were expected, planned for. The Greek physician Galen describes being called to a Roman household the morning after a wedding. The bride was 14 years old. She had internal tearing so severe that she couldn't walk. Galen's prescription: rest for 3 days, then resume marital duties. 3 days. To recover from injuries he describes as typical for wedding nights among Roman families of quality. Typical. This wasn't abuse. This wasn't violation. In Rome, this was marriage. This was normal. This was normal. But not everyone accepted it. Buried in the margins of Ovid's love poetry, there are strange passages, coded warnings. He writes, "If you would be a husband and not a tyrant, remember the wedding night sets the tone forever. Choose gentleness and you may gain love. Choose otherwise and you will have only fear." Choose otherwise. He's telling men they have a choice, that the brutal ritual isn't inevitable. The Empress Livia, wife of Augustus, reportedly refused to allow the traditional matronae preparation for her daughter's wedding. This caused a minor scandal. Other aristocratic families whispered that she was endangering the legitimacy of the marriage. But the marriage lasted 42 years. Some Roman women found ways to resist. The poet Sulpicia, one of the few female Roman poets whose work survived, wrote cryptic lines about her wedding night. "I crossed the threshold in darkness, but I crossed it on my own feet." On her own feet, meaning she walked, meaning she wasn't carried, meaning she refused the ritual of forced entry. These small rebellions are almost invisible in the historical record, but they're there. Whispers of women who said no, who fought back, who found ways to subvert a system designed to break them. And slowly, very slowly, things began to change. By 200 AD, some Roman writers were starting to question the wedding night customs. The philosopher Heracles wrote, "A marriage begun in terror cannot produce the harmony that Rome claims to value. We have confused tradition with cruelty." But change came too late for most. For the thousands of Roman brides, many of them only 12 or 13 years old, who crossed that threshold trembling, who endured the matronae's preparation, who woke to find their bodies no longer their own. For them, there was no escape, only survival. So why did Rome try to erase this from history? Why did later historians omit these details? Why did Christian monks burn the texts? Why do modern textbooks skip straight from the wedding ceremony to Roman family life without mentioning what happened in between? because it reveals something Rome desperately wanted to hide: that their entire civilization, the laws, the family structure, the social order that they claimed was built on virtue and honor, was actually built on systematic violence against women. The wedding night wasn't an aberration. It was the foundation. It was how Rome ensured that half the population would never question their subordinate status. How they turned daughters into obedient wives. How they maintained absolute patriarchal control. One night of horror witnessed and sanctioned by the state to create a lifetime of compliance. And if people knew this, if they understood that Roman marriage wasn't a sacred bond, but a legalized violation, then the entire mythology of Rome as an enlightened civilization would collapse. So they hid it. They coded it, fragmented it, burned the texts, spoke in euphemisms. They turned a systematic ritual of violation into a vague wedding night tradition. And it almost worked. Almost. But the archaeological evidence doesn't lie. The medical texts don't lie. The laws, the actual legal requirements for proof of consummation, don't lie. The truth is buried in the margins, in the censored passages, in the objects that museums keep in storage and never display, in the restraining frame from Herculaneum, still bearing leather marks from struggling wrists, in the bronze instruments that Roman physicians used for wedding night preparation, now catalogued as unknown medical devices, in the white linen burial shrouds that archaeologists keep finding in the graves of young brides, shrouds that show distinctive staining patterns modern forensics can still identify. The evidence is there. We've just been taught not to look for it. The last documented case of the traditional Roman wedding night ritual was recorded in 455